It is either very late at night or early in the morning here in London. Yonit and I have both been up all night watching the presidential debate of Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, and we are now gathering some thoughts. It looked like a pretty slam dunk win from where I'm looking. How does it look from where you are, Yonit?
I don't know. The only line that I had, the few minutes that we were preparing for this conversation was, the role of Joe Biden will be played tonight by Donald Trump. That is how it felt from, my vantage point. It was, look, she did something that is really risky because with someone like Donald Trump, you can either, run from a fight or ignore the fight, but she picked a fight. Like from the first minutes of this, it was very clear that she was trying to throw him off balance. I think the first thing she said that was, the thing that completely was a tipping point was when she talked about his rallies and she said, people are leaving your rallies because they're bored. And you could see that as a moment, from that moment on, she was in control of this. He was on the defensive the whole time, even with topics that could have been his strong suit, like the economy, like immigration. He just couldn't get anywhere with this. And to me, it was interesting. She not only managed to sort of attack him and to even in the midst of all this present herself to the American people, right? Because almost 30% told the New York Times they don't know who she is. So she managed to sort of inject her biography in this. But also she kind of managed to be the narrator of this whole story because she kept saying to the American people, this is not what this should be about. It should be about something else. She was very good. And he was really, as for someone who knows television, knows the medium, and this was his 7th debate, he wasn't good at all.
So it's an Unholy special update episode, and we are talking all about this presidential debate. I agree with you. There's been an instant CNN poll that says 63% of those watching thought Kamala Harris won, 37% gave it to Donald Trump. I completely agreed with you about from the very moment. I thought you were going to talk about even before they spoke, just in terms of body language, the very first seconds of the debate, the candidates are introduced and walk onto the stage. She walked over to him. He looked uncertain. She introduced herself, Kamala Harris, she says, as if you might not know, and initiates a handshake. I thought that was like something out of one of those kind of corporate manuals about executive owning the room advice, because she, from there on, was on the front foot. She was active. He was sort of passive or reactive. The first 15, 20 minutes, and a lot of the debate experts, we had Mike Murphy and David Axelrod on the podcast a while back. They and others had been saying the first 20 minutes are really important. In those first 15, 20 minutes, he actually was quite good. And she was, I thought, visibly nervous. You could see that thing that happens to people,
Indeed,
not as expert as you on TV, when their mouth dries a little bit and their kind of lips were smacking a little bit. And the voice was not fully steady. And he brought sort of good Trump to the debate, which is that effective Trump that did win in 2016. It's the guy who talks about China and says, I did these tariffs. If they were so bad, how come you guys have kept them? He said, when confronted about, the people who he used to employ in his administration, the way they've all turned on him, he said, that's because I fired them. I fire people when they make mistakes. And I thought he's reminding people there of The Apprentice and that persona. I always try and think of this not as me, but if I was one of those undecided voters or even kind of quite Trump-friendly voters, that macho thing that I have to say personally, if it's me, really grates on me, but I know it plays for some American voters. And I was thinking he was being quite assertive, but absolutely, as you say, a turning point came. And I've looked again, actually, now at one of those rush transcripts of the debate, and they were back to back. The first thing that happened was abortion, and she's really good and strong on that and put him right on the defensive, saying Trump abortion bans are leading to, women in, bleeding out in the car while they're waiting for a procedure, etc. And then straight after that, she turned the question to that point about rallies, and it completely knocked him off his game. It was bait, and he took the bait. And the interesting thing was, he then went in. Maybe it was some bit of his brain that once she talked about rallies, he then went into rally mode. And, just a few months back, I was at one of those Trump rallies. They are wild. They're just crazy. And you always think if normal people saw this, there's no way they'd be thinking this guy could be president. He just rambles on 90 minutes. People do drift away. They do get bored. She's completely right about that. But by hearing rallies mentioned, he then went into his rally persona and started talking about, immigrants eating pets. And just, he went into the crazy. And I saw one commentator said...
By the way, that was his answer on immigration, which is her weak spot. And instead of hitting her with that, he went into that, derailed the whole thing.
And he brought question after question back to migration. This pundit said, the last debate showed that that Joe Biden was too old to be president. Well, this debate showed that Donald Trump is too crazy to be president. I'm not sure it was as much of a slam dunk as the June 27th Biden debate was, which was obviously devastating. But this was really, really bad for him. I'm just wondering if we should talk on about that block where they had a whole block of the debate on Israel.
Yeah, we will. I just, before we get to that, I kept asking myself while watching this, what did Kamala Harris have that Hillary Clinton didn't? And I think two things are the answer to that question. One is Donald Trump and the other is Hillary Clinton. First of all, she had a Donald Trump who's 8 years older, which in that he's 78, and that's a difference. And the other thing is she had the precedent of Hillary Clinton, and optics are important. So that the voter already saw a woman on stage in the presidential debate. It wasn't as strange or unique as it was 8 years ago. Of course, I think also the fact that voters already knew Hillary Clinton very well and had made up their mind. And Kamala Harris is still, maybe after this evening, much less, but an unknown quantity to many. Now, as you mentioned, Israel was talked a lot about, which is something Israelis like to be the focus of attention. So let's talk a little bit about what they both said. She, I think, put out the very standard lines of the Democratic Party. By the way, you were talking about body language. It was pretty clear that this was a moment where she was uncomfortable in the sense that she was reading from lines that were memorized. And she said, first of all, that she started by saying that the Hamas started this with the massacre of 1,200 Israelis. She did say the war must end immediately. There must be a release of hostages and a ceasefire. She added something to me. It was interesting because it was an addendum to what she said in the interview, in the CNN interview. She said, I'd protect Israel, particularly Iran, adding Iran into the mix. I think that the two things that Israelis would notice. One is she didn't say we have to crush Hamas, we have to get rid of Hamas, get rid of those guys, all this kind of language that the terminology that Joe Biden used, at least in the beginning. And another thing is, of course, for Israelis, this again is pretty standard what she said. She didn't veer off from the party line. But when you say we have to chart a course for a Palestinian state, to Israelis after October 7th, that sounds a little bit, they feel like it's tone deaf. Of course, we've talked about this a lot on the podcast. They feel like, wait a minute, they had a statelet in Gaza and this is what happened. So it's hard for them to process this. But generally speaking, she didn't say anything out of the ordinary. I think that the Netanyahu would be very worried to hear her saying you should have a ceasefire immediately. By the way, Trump has said the same thing. He just didn't say it in the debate. What he did say in this debate was she hates Israel. She hates Israel. If she's elected, Israel will not exist in 2 years. In a weird way of also trying to lure in the Arab vote, she said both Jews and Arabs would die if she's elected. That was a whole sort of bizarre moment, which didn't work that well for him. But that was the sort of Israel part of the debate.
Yeah, I thought his answer there was a mess because he said she hates Israel straight after she had begun her answer, and she didn't have to. The grammar of the question didn't require her to do this. She began her question by saying, let's remind ourselves how we got here. And she talked about October the 7th. She talked about the 1,200 killed. She also went out of her way to say women were horribly raped. Now, let's remember, you and I have talked about this before, that point about mentioning the sexual violence is not a uncontested point by sections of the American left. There are people who will not have been happy to hear her say that. That required some bravery to say that. And it made it then all the more jarring to hear him say she hates Israel, because the average viewer, not somebody steeped in this, thought, I just heard what she said. She didn't sound like someone who hated Israel.
Right. She said it will protect Israel. Right.
And absolutely, we will always protect Israel's right to defend itself. He then said, as you just mentioned, this, lurid notion that Israel will not last 2 years if she's president, and tried to make the not just that bad things will happen to Arabs. Specifically, Arabs should fear Israel not existing because they will somehow be hurt in that process. It was a real jumble. It was emblematic, actually, of how many of his answers were tangled and jumbled and garbled. You could just about, especially if you're used to sort of speaking Trump and going to Trump rallies, you could work out what he was trying to do. But again, you'll think if the average voter who doesn't really tune into this stuff ever, or certainly not all the time, that would have just sounded confusing. The point about the two-state solution mentioned, she has to do that because she's got a whole constituency. No, I know
right.
you didn't.
She has her internal politics. I'm just saying this is how it is.
Well, and just a larger point, I was just going to say about how, because a similar thing has been going on in Britain with Keir Starmer, it is now the only way that politicians who are not of the right can talk about Israel. The only way they can keep that constituency with them, who is appalled by 40,000 deaths, according anyway to Gaza Health Ministry controlled by Hamas figures, is by saying that box has to be ticked. There will be, we will work towards a Palestinian state. And it's just a mark of where Israel is, that hearing that, exactly the way you said, that's jarring for Israelis, and yet it is the absolute minimum position for somebody, in her position. So I thought that exchange was interesting in itself, but also illustrative or emblematic of the whole wider debate. I think the other reason why Netanyahu would be worried is simply because Kamala Harris did so well. Because
he was cashing in on him winning.
Yeah. I mean, he is assuming / hoping for Donald Trump to win, and this debate did not make you think you were looking at a winning candidate in Donald Trump. No. On the contrary, she looked like somebody who had cleared the bar. Just want to wait. What last point on your very good point about Hillary Clinton and how much easier it is to be the second nominee, female nominee, rather than the first. It just struck me that when we say somebody looking presidential, that had until 2016, and maybe still until now, has always been a male adjective. What we mean by that, because there have only been male presidents, she has had to sort of model a different kind of leadership. And I really thought tonight she is really doing that, because she was authoritative. She showed sort of steadiness in exactly the way that he was so unsteady. And I just thought we are beginning to see what is, maybe it's not so new in countries that have had female leaders, but for America, this is something new taking shape. A different, she's modeling a new form of female presidential gravitas and authority. It's different.
Mm-hmm. It is different. I should just remind ourselves that even after 2016, I think everyone thought Hillary won the debate. She still lost the election. So there are a few weeks to go. I would want to say something about the moderators, about Lindsay Davis and about David Muir. Obviously, a very different decision this time to fact check in real time, which CNN did not do. I'll say two things about that. One is, on the level of journalism, that's a good decision. And also on the level of television, because it makes for a more fiery debate and much less boring. But you do see already, and you kind of saw it during the debate already, the Republican feed saying this is unfair. Now, I do want to say something. They never corrected her. They never fact-checked her, not even once. Now, the optics are problematic here because you can't convince me that in 90 minutes, any politician will not blur the truth a little or hide some of the truth or make some inaccuracies, and they never once corrected her. And I think that is a problem. If you're saying, I'm going to fact-check, then at least get some sort of, or attempt at some sort of balance in what you are, where you're interjecting.
Just on that particular point, I think they made a decision which is we can't fact check everything. So when somebody's blurring or being a bit hazy, that won't justify an intervention from us. It will have to be an egregious, howling lie before we'll come in. And of those, and I absolutely noticed that they didn't jump in on her. But of those, they went for, people are eating pets, doctors are executing babies after they've been born. They went for the absolute, or that he won the 2020 election. So I think they made that rule, they stuck to it. But the optics were, as you say, it looked as if they were only intervening on him. And so surrogates for Donald Trump, Vivek Ramaswamy and others, are saying it was 3-1. By the way,
I think including Trump himself tweeting that
yeah,
line.
it just Trump, Vivek Ramaswamy did it during the debate, which is another point that made me think, oh wow, they think he's losing, because you don't do that if you feel you're winning. You don't start, attacking the ref if you're 3-0 ahead. And this time they felt they were behind. So I do take your point, although I do wonder if the result, if they had fact checked her on minor things to balance out though the fact they were fact checking him on major things, would that have been to, in the jargon, both sides, something which wasn't equal?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps it was to some extent. I think to some extent that was problematic. I think the only answer he gave, which was a good answer, was his last answer, where he said, all your plans are great. Why didn't you do it in 3.5 years you had in the White House? By the way, he could have said that earlier. He could have kept saying, just Americans, ask yourself if you're better off now than you were 4 years ago, and he didn't. He couldn't manage to bring her back to saying, you are the vice president now. I mean, all of your plans, great, but why haven't you implemented any or tried any of that? He didn't, for some reason, he couldn't do that at all. And she, another thing I have to say, again, being the representative of television journalism in this conversation, she managed to, she got the medium better, which is very strange when you're standing across from Trump. Her mannerisms, her faces that were obviously well rehearsed to what he was saying. She was standing, she was looking at him, sometimes looking at the camera. He wasn't looking at her, which was also a strange decision in a way. I mean, she got it in a way that Biden didn't in the debate in June.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have time to talk about this in the coming weeks, but the gender differences and the gender divide, which is a huge theme of this campaign, were very visible in this, because I saw somebody note that she had an expression on her face when he was speaking often, which a lot of women will be very used to adopting, which is this combination of pity and disgust, which I thought was really apposite. But I was then thinking, if you are one of those 20-year-old men who is very, in the manoverse, who is very drawn to Trump and his machismo, did you find that the split screen expressions of her where they were disapproving and judgmental and disdainful, was there something gendered there that will actually make some men, again, it's a particular type of man, who will be somehow sympathetic or aligned to Donald Trump? I suspect the kind of man who would react that way was going to vote for Donald Trump anyway, but I suspect there were some men bristling at her reaction, which looked like the sort of the woman who thinks this man is a dinosaur, which he was and is, but saw it on her face.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps there were some moments where the mannerisms were a bit exaggerated, but the answer to your question is Taylor Swift endorsed her. So, I mean, isn't that the big headline of this morning? So.
Well, a good night gets even better for Kamala Harris. I think, to relate to my point before, Kamala Harris needs an endorsement from an influencer among young men. She needs that now, before this becomes a kind of battle of men versus women this election.
Right. And if you were talking about men who are influencers, I think probably the last thing you want to do if you want to boost your foreign affairs and foreign policy credentials is to say that Viktor Orbán is a big fan of yours. Right. I mean, that wasn't a good moment for him either.
It was interesting that she didn't come back on that. It was sort of like saying, well, Bernie Madoff says that I'm a really good financial advisor.
Hannibal Lecter complimented my hospitality skills, right? It's like the same thing.
I mean, it's a very odd endorsement to have brandished, but yeah, I think for cognoscenti, they'll be thinking not good. I'm not sure among the undecideds they know who Viktor Orbán is, but that will give ammunition for Democrats afterwards. And remember, that's so often how these debates are played out. It's actually on social media and in surrogates and talking points. And I think there's several days worth of material here to work on, starting with pet eating, which I think will have captured the imagination. So I think a very big win for her tonight. And there were words and talk of her momentum having slowed before this debate. There was some polling that was a bit uncomfortable. I suspect this will move the needle back in her favor, but I think you were absolutely right to mention what happened in 2016. I, learned, when I was a correspondent in Washington, that when the entire Washington media have a consensus, which they have now, which is that she won it and it's, game over, they're so often wrong. And
not in this
so
election.
I think it's too close. There are many more twists to happen. Let's put it down a very clear big win and very good night for her. But this is not over.
No, it's definitely not over. And what's so interesting is that he had a horrible night, but you heard no one in the Republican Party saying, maybe we should think of a different candidate. Not only because the Republican Party has been taken over by Trump, but also because it reminds you, right? It echoes that line, the Bill Clinton famous line, right? Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. What happened to Biden in that disastrous debate of June is it wasn't even over before the Democratic Party started asking who's going to replace him and essentially telling him, here's the door, it swings inwards, whereas no one's going to do that for Trump. So that is where we are. He is hurt, but he is not out of the race. And we have, 56 days to go. That's a long time in this kind of race.
Yeah, absolutely right. What we don't know is if this had been in June, would they be talking about that? I suspect they wouldn't, for the reason you say, which is they're just so loyal. It is obviously now too late for them to do anything, so they are stuck with him. But I do notice a little bit of a breakdown of party discipline. Lindsey Graham saying afterwards this was a disaster, and saying that the debate team should be fired or whatever, rather than saying Trump himself. But, that's a little sign. He's a real bellwether. Weather vane, actually, is more accurate. He just goes whichever way the wind is blowing. And that's a sign, a straw in the wind, perhaps. But 56 days to go, not over yet by any means, but a significant and good night for her. So look, we'll be back at the end of the week with a regular full episode with breaking down some of this and other stuff.
We will. We'll see you then.